Well, this morning we're going to begin a new sermon series that's entitled Scary Close. One of the major effects of sin, all the way back to the garden, has been that the consequence of sin is that we have been layered over with shame. And the unintended consequence of that is a desire to cover up and withdraw from other people. And that's a problem because at the end of the day, most of us want to get to know other people and we want to be known by other people. And so we wind up feeling incredibly conflicted. And the idea of getting close to other people is kind of scary. And thus the title, Scary Close. So our goal over the next few weeks is to look at a variety of relationships within our life, starting with more casual ones and going deeper from week to week, to see how we can overcome that instinct to want to hide and sometimes even to sabotage those relationships. Now, by way of full disclosure, this title, Scary Close, is actually the title of a brand new book by Donald Miller, and we are unabashedly ripping it off for this sermon series because it captures so well that emotional dynamic that we feel when it comes to relationships. So over the next few weeks, we're going to take a look at what Scripture has to say about relationships with friends, relationships in the context of physical intimacy, spiritual intimacy, family relationships. But this morning, we're going to start with our relationships with the people who literally live right next door to us, our neighbors wherever we live. It just so happens, by the way, as I mentioned at the beginning of the service, that today is a day that we are gathering with 20-plus churches in Arvada to preach the same message and to pull together in common cause. So you could go to any one of those 20 churches today and you would hear not the identical message, but the same thrust in the message today. For 5 years now, pastors and churches have been meeting together to pray for one another, to encourage each other, and to try to move from a posture of competition to one of cooperation. Now, that may not sound like any big deal to you. I got to tell you, folks, over the history of our nation, to try to get churches to work together in common cause, to not see themselves in competition, has been a huge undertaking. In fact, it rarely happens. In fact, competition has been such a watchword for years. I believe that the reason for that is because we as pastors get our egos all caught up in this, and churches want to make sure that theirs is one of the best on the block. And so rather than seeing each other as allies, we see ourselves competitive. So it has been absolutely amazing and wonderful for me to be able to gather with these other pastors, to get to know them, to have some very deep conversations, and to recognize we're in this together. Pastor Dave Runyon, who is one of the guys who has catalyzed this in our community, is now literally being asked by mayors and by church groups across the country to come and do this neighboring stuff with them. And I'm embarrassed to say this, but you know the number one question he gets as he goes to these other communities? How in the world did you get all these different churches to actually sit down together and try to love each other? But by God's grace, it can happen, and it does happen, even though it means we have to put our egos aside and become concerned more about the advance of God's kingdom than our little fiefdom. So, here we are this morning. We are standing with these 20 other churches, and we're going to talk about the central role of learning to love our neighbors so that we will be known by our love. But this morning, we're going to approach it from a slightly different angle. And Dave Runyon is calling this the Art of Neighboring 2.0. So you can visit again the churches, and you'll hear this same thing. In just a moment, we're going to take a look at a passage from the New Testament, from Luke chapter 7, if you want to begin to open there in your Bibles. But before we do that, I want to check in with you to see how you guys are doing several years into this on your block map. Would you all take your bulletins out and pull this little yellow sheet out? Now, many of you recognize this tool. This is one we've been using for a number of years now. And I know a lot of us don't like this thing because it makes me feel guilty, I'm supposed to know all my neighbors' names. Now, your house may not be configured exactly like this, but the goal is to be able to fill in the names of all 8 families that live right around you. So, how are you coming with this? You making some progress as we've been proceeding over the years? I just want to say a word of reminder. You can't love somebody if you don't even know their name. So we got to get to know people's names, and that's one of the places where we start. Last summer on West 85th Circle, we had a block party. In fact, it got most of the circle, not entirely, but there was a lot of folks who were showing up. And so Di did something genius. She went onto the computer and she went on Google Earth and she got that overhead shot, zoomed right in on West 85th Circle, printed it off so there were houses all the way along. And we went from couple to couple, family to family, filling in the name. We got about 2/3 of the names of the people on our street filled in. Now, I've never been good with names, and now that I'm over 60, it's not helping the situation. And I wish I could tell you, since we did that, I've got them all down. A week later, it's like, oh yeah, who lives in that house? Yeah. It's a struggle, but it really helps to make an effort to get to know people's names. Now, some of you have got this nailed. You've been living on your block for a while now. You've known your neighbors for years. You guys have bodacious parties. God bless you all. But for most of us, that's not the case. We have to work at this. When my son visits us with his family from San Francisco, do you know what he calls Arvada? The land of fences. Because there's fences everywhere here. And that's not a bad thing. Fences are not insurmountable, but they are symbolic of how we all like to keep to our space. Of course, he and Rebecca, they just bought a 4-bedroom house in the Sunset District in San Francisco. Guess what they have in their backyard? Fences as well, yeah. But that's okay. So we want to get to know those people, fences or no people. We want to get to know at least those 8 families around us. But once we get their name, where do we go from there? What do you do next? How can we form intentional relationships with our literal neighbors? Well, often our default setting is to ask the question, how can I serve them? What can I do for them? This morning, we want to turn that question on its head, as odd as this sounds, and ask the question, what might they be able to do for you? And could we discover the art of receiving? Very often, you and I will build bridges, not only by what we do and by what we give, but also by what we receive. Let's take a look at a fascinating text in Luke chapter 7, and we're going to pick it up at verse 36. And we're going to see how Jesus himself not only gave to other people, but he was also willing to receive. And I want you to notice how this interaction plays out. Let's pick it up at verse 36. Now, one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him. So he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. When a woman who had lived a sinful life, what do you think that means, by the way? She'd been a loose woman, prostitute, something like that. In that town, learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. She brought an alabaster jar of perfume. And as she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisees who invited him saw this, he said to himself, when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who was touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. Jesus answered him, "Simon, I have something to tell you." "Tell me, teacher," he said. Two men owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he canceled the debts of both. Now, which of them will owe him more? Simon replies, "I suppose the one who had the bigger debt canceled." "You have judged correctly," Jesus said. Then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, "Do you see this woman?" I love that line, by the way. "Do you see this woman? I came into your house, and you did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman from the time I entered has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, for she loved much. But he who has been forgiven little loves little." Then Jesus said to her, "Your sins are forgiven." And the other guests began to say among themselves, "Who is this who even forgives sins?" And Jesus said to the woman, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." Obviously, part of what is so striking about this passage is that this is one of the few occasions when we get to see Jesus letting somebody minister to him, do something for him. Jesus was always serving other people, whether it was healing the crowds or feeding people or teaching them or talking with them one-on-one. This time, however, he allowed the woman to do something for him. Now, I've got to admit, this particular act wouldn't be everybody's cup of tea, because I know some of you here are severely allergic to perfume. Do we have anybody here allergic to perfume? How many of you, yeah, we got a few here. How many of you get headaches when somebody around you is wearing strong cologne? Yeah. So for some of us, this might be a bit of a mixed bag. But Jesus wasn't just willing to allow her to do something for him. He did something that meant he allowed something that meant a great deal to her. Not only did she pour the perfume, but she began weeping on his feet, and she dried those tears with her hair. Now, that's a fairly intimate gesture on several levels. And the Pharisees were shocked that Jesus would let a woman with this reputation touch him in such a way. But it meant a great deal to her, and this built a bridge between Jesus and this woman. And there's a few things in particular I want us to notice this morning that we can take and apply to our lives as well. The first thing is actually a question. Do we see the people that God has put all around us, especially our literal neighbors? Look at verse 44 again. Then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, "Do you see this woman?" Isn't that an interesting question? Do we actually see the people who are right in front of us? Or do we fail to see them because we are so busy with our full lives, so much on the go, we don't even notice the people who live right around us? Or perhaps we are blinded by preconceived notions. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is just stop and actually take notice of the people who are living around us. To notice them as more than just names on a square, but as people with names and faces. I've got to tell you, folks, I'm sometimes surprised how much my neighbors know about me. I've had neighbors say to me sometimes, "John, we know you are way busy. We see your car pull out of the driveway at 8:30 in the morning, and a lot of days you pull back into the driveway at 9 o'clock at night." It's like, how did you notice but they do. They notice my coming and my going. And they're paying attention. I need to pay attention and notice them as much as they notice me. Number 2, know that there is an art to receiving. Did you ever have the inclination? We sometimes think, okay, it's time for me to be super neighbor, and I'm going to put on my cape, and I'm going to go over and do something spectacular for my neighbor. I'm going to take care of that widow or take care of those at-risk No, we don't have to be super neighbor. We can just be who we are, and we can be receiving as well as giving. Because relationships, by their very nature, are two-way streets. And something rather deep happens when we not only give, but when we receive, when we borrow a tool or ask for help. It creates dignity and a sense of self-worth on both parties. That's exactly what happened between Jesus and this woman. One of my neighbors, the guy who lives right next door to me, is not in the construction industry, but over the years, he has studied a lot of stuff, and he knows how to figure out how things work. And so on many occasions, out of desperation, I've gone over and I've knocked, say, hey, my sprinkler system is bust, can you give me, or my door won't open, or whatever it is. And time after time, he's Johnny on the spot. His name's not John, by the way. He's Johnny on the spot, and he comes over, and he is always not only eager, he is happy to lend a hand. It makes him feel good when he knows how to fix something. It is actually affirming to him, and it has actually strengthened our relationship along the way. And then number 3, know that God has placed us in our specific neighborhoods for a reason. In other words, could your place of residence be a divine appointment? When the Apostle Paul was in Athens, he went to Mars Hill while he was there, and he interacted with a whole bunch of people who had all these different idols. And then he noticed one that said it was an idol to an unknown God. And he says to all those philosophers, he says, let me tell you about this God who you don't know, who is actually the one true God. And then notice what Paul says in Acts 17:26. From one man he made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he determined the times set for them and the exact places where they should live. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each of us. Could it be that God has determined the exact place where you are going to live so that when people reach out for what may be for them an unknown God, there'll be handles, there'll be a touch point, and you might be that point of connection for them. You are there for a reason. So it might well be that God has given you a divine appointment. Dave Runyon is asking us as pastors, what if every churched person in this community saw themselves as appointed by God to be a loving representative of Christ right in their neighborhood? And we did that all over Arvada. Think of the blessing that could be to the city of Arvada if we lived in love and in concern. God has placed you where you are. I recently read I listened to a fascinating book, and the title of it is called The Like Switch. Not the light switch, the like switch. It's written by a guy by the name of Dr. Jack Schaefer. He's a former FBI agent who specializes in behavioral analysis. And in the book, he talks about how, as we interact with people, there are very predictable ways in which we form friendships. And he's got in the first chapter of the book what he calls the friendship formula. Now, I know you can't reduce relationships to a mathematical formula, but he breaks down relationships into their 4 most basic components. And it's this. You ready? I want you to write this down on your bulletin notes. Proximity plus frequency plus duration plus intensity equals friendship. Isn't that pretty good? Let me say that again. Proximity plus frequency plus duration plus intensity equals friendship. Now, that's not rocket science, but I've never seen somebody break down friendship into the components like that. Take proximity, for example. That increases the likelihood of interaction. Di and I have some wonderful friends that we left behind in Lafayette, Indiana. but we're not proximate to them anymore. We don't get to interact with them very often. And so the lack of proximity makes a real strain on maintaining our relationships with them. One of the greatest assets you bring to your immediate neighbors is that you live right there. It is built in that you're going to see them, which leads to frequency. The more frequently you interact with somebody, the greater the likelihood that you'll get to know them. But even if the frequency is high, those interactions need to be more than, "Hey, Charlie, how you doing? How about them Broncos?" The duration has to be a little bit longer. And as the duration goes up, the more you will begin to get to know about people, and the more it will open the door for intensity. Now, let me give you an example. You may have a great relationship with the barista at the local Starbucks in the sense that you've got proximity, they're right down the street, frequency. Some of you, I know, go to Starbucks every day to get your fix. But duration may be brief, and intensity may go no deeper than, "I'll have a mocha chai latte, please." Hopefully, there will be growing depth in our relationships, but the more you increase those four things, the more likelihood you'll become friends. The more you decrease those things, the less likely you will be. But there's an underlying assumption here, folks. And do you know what that underlying assumption of that formula is? One word: time. It takes time to invest and raise those things. Guess what the most precious commodity of most Americans is? It's time. But if we are going to impact our community with the love of Jesus Christ, we have to be willing to sacrifice some of that precious commodity and make that investment in our neighbors. Proximity and frequency and duration and intensity. I think that's definitely worth our investment. God may well have placed you strategically exactly where you live to be His representative in your neighborhood. So how you doing with your neighbors? Are you making headway? I want you to pull out this sheet again. And as we wrap up today, I want to ask you to take a moment and see how you do. See if you can fill in these names. And then I'm going to ask you to do something for me. I'm going to ask you in the quietness of your own heart to take a moment and to pray for one of these neighbors. Ask God's blessing on them. And ask the Lord to reveal to you what one small step you might take to further advance that relationship.